The fog clung to the hills of eastern Kentucky like a shroud, swallowing the winding road before it could lead anywhere familiar. At the edge of the forest, the community's compound rose suddenly from the mist, its wooden spires dark and jagged, windows glowing with a faint, almost unnatural light. The air was heavy, not with the scent of the soil or the forest, but with something else, an unease that pressed against the ribs like a living thing. Tabitha had first heard of the community from a trembling voice in a small diner just off the interstate. The woman who whispered the story over a chipped mug of coffee had said the words almost as a confession: people disappear there. Not just young folks, not just men or women, everyone who goes stays. Nobody leaves. At the time, Tabitha had written it off as folklore, a cautionary tale to keep children from wandering into the hills. But as she drove deeper into eastern Kentucky, the roads narrowing into twisted ribbons of asphalt and gravel, she could feel a growing knot in her stomach that told her the tale might be more than myth. The GPS flickered and died, leaving her with only instinct and the murmur of locals, none willing to give directions beyond vague gestures toward the forested ridges. Each passing mile seemed to swallow familiar landmarks, replacing them with gnarled trees that pressed toward the road as if they were alive and watching. Her headlights reflected off fog so dense it seemed almost tactile, so that each turn of the wheel felt like entering a new, unknowable dimension. The compound appeared suddenly, like a memory emerging from a dream, its presence so abrupt she slammed the brakes and stared through the windshield. Wooden spires jutted jaggedly into the sky, their tips shrouded in mist, the edges of the structures dark as though the light itself feared to touch them. Windows glowed faintly, a muted amber that did not seem to belong to the natural world. A feeling, call it intuition or dread, took root in Tabitha's chest, tightening and constricting like a hand pressing against her lungs. She had chased stories across half the country before, seen abandoned towns and closed factories, but nothing had ever made her pause like this. This was not decay, it was preservation of some other, older intent, one she could not yet name but sensed in every shadowed corner. When she parked her car at the edge of the gravel path, the air seemed heavier, not with mist or rain, but with a presence, pressing against her skin and filling her ears with silence. Even the wind that rustled the leaves in the surrounding wood seemed subdued, respectful, or perhaps afraid. She stepped out and felt the chill of the fog creep into her boots and gloves, crawling along her spine. She wanted to write in her notebook, to capture this sensation, but the words felt inadequate against the oppressive quiet. Somewhere beyond the spires, faint sounds stirred, footsteps perhaps, or voices, but when she strained to listen, the fog swallowed them, leaving only the whisper of her own breathing. The first people she saw moved with a fluidity that unnerved her. Men, women, and children walked in pairs or alone, carrying baskets, tending small gardens, or guiding livestock she hadn't noticed before. Their faces were calm, smiles small and practiced, eyes hollow as though observing the world while remaining untouched by it. When their gazes met hers, there was no recognition, only acknowledgement, fleeting and polite, like nodding to a stranger who had stumbled into your home by accident. One young boy passed her quickly, and when she followed him with her eyes, she realized he was smiling, but the smile did not reach the eyes, and it felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. The sensation of being watched intensified, though no one followed her. Everything was deliberate, controlled, measured, as if the very air of the compound conspired to contain intrusions. She took a hesitant step forward toward the main building, notebook clutched in one hand, camera in the other. The gravel crunched underfoot, louder than expected, echoing strangely through the mist. She could hear the soft murmur of a hymn or chant, a sound that was both familiar and alien, drifting from somewhere deep within the compound. It was a sound meant to soothe, to guide, but beneath it lurked a tension she could not place, a hidden sharpness, as if the melody was layered with warnings. Her hand hovered over the door handle, and she hesitated. Something in her mind screamed that leaving would be easy, turning back down the gravel path and disappearing into the fog that had welcomed her, but curiosity, that insistent, dangerous companion, kept her rooted in place. The moment was broken when the door creaked open before she could knock. A man stepped into the dim light, tall, unnervingly composed, his face pale and calm, his eyes a deep shade that seemed to look through her rather than at her. "We've been expecting you," he said softly, yet every syllable seemed to resonate through her chest. There was something in the cadence, in the way he spoke, that made her stomach churn. She wanted to retreat, to drive away and leave the rumors behind, but the car, the road, even the fog beyond seemed distant now, as though they belonged to another world entirely. Her mind raced with questions, but each one seemed insufficient to explain the sense of inevitability that settled over her. As he gestured her inside, the chanting softened, drawing back into the walls, leaving an echo of unease. The smell of burning incense, or was it something else, something more acrid, reached her, filling her lungs with a heaviness that made her head swim. She stepped forward, compelled by forces she could not articulate, and with each step, the outside world, the road, the fog, the familiar mountains, slipped further from her grasp. Somewhere deep in the recesses of her mind, a warning whispered, some stories are not meant to be chased. Some doors, once opened, do not permit retreat. Yet, with trembling hands and racing heart, Tabitha crossed the threshold into the community, unaware that her arrival was not an accident, that the eyes watching her had been waiting for years, and that once inside, she might never see the foggy hills of Kentucky again. The first time Tabitha stepped into the compound, she felt a strange sense of order beneath the chaos she had imagined. Every movement, every gesture of the resident seemed deliberate, choreographed, almost ritualistic, yet the precision only heightened her unease. She had barely taken her first cautious steps into the main building when she realized she needed a place to document everything, the people, the sounds, the unspoken rules she could sense but not yet name. That's when her wandering feet led her to the basement, a narrow stairwell hidden behind a tall, unmarked door that swung open under the faint pressure of her hand. Dust and a musty heaviness drifted upward, wrapping her senses in a haze that smelled faintly of old paper and damp wood. She descended slowly, every step accompanied by the creak of timber that seemed louder than any sound she had encountered on the fog-laden road outside. The basement was dimly lit by a single swinging bulb, its weak glow reflecting off rows of shelves that were lined with jars, ledgers, and bundles of paper stacked in neat, almost obsessive order. At first, it seemed like an archive of mundane records, accounts, deliveries, the sort of meticulous accounting one might expect from any self-sustaining community, but one particular book caught her eye. Bound in worn leather, its spine cracked from age, the ledger sat on a table, waiting. It was unmarked, yet something about it drew her forward, a magnetic pull that made her forget the chill in the air or the soft footsteps she thought she heard above. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The pages were yellowed, edges brittle, and the ink faded in some places. At first, the entries appeared ordinary, names, dates, occasional notes on contributions to the community. But as she flipped further, the pattern changed, subtle but undeniable. Names repeated across the pages, accompanied by cryptic symbols and short annotations she could not immediately decipher. Some entries had the word new written beside them, while others bore dates that seemed too recent to be merely archival. Her eyes widened when she realized that the list included not just the residents she had glimpsed outside, but people whose faces had haunted local news reports over the past decades. Names she had read in online forums, in faded newspaper clippings, in anonymous accounts, names of those who had vanished without a trace. Tabitha's breath caught as she ran her finger down the columns of the ledger. Each name seemed carefully recorded, precise, almost ritualistic in the spacing and strokes of the pen. Some had tiny marks beside them, a series of slashes or dots she couldn't yet interpret, like a code only understood by the community itself. She shivered, the realization dawning slowly and coldly, this was not a record of lives merely lived, but of lives taken, catalogued, and controlled. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, as though the air itself had thickened with the knowledge she had stumbled upon. The deeper she delved into the ledger, the more terrifying the patterns became. Entries from 27 years ago, meticulously maintained year by year, recorded every person who had joined the community. And then she noticed the peculiar consistency of disappearance. Each name had a corresponding date when the person had arrived, but beyond that, no note of them leaving, no reference to any exit. The ledger was not simply a record of members, it was a record of containment. Her hand shook as she traced the lines with her finger, the reality of the situation embedding itself with every page turn. She realized she was holding proof of what the locals had whispered in hushed tones for decades. The missing, the vanished, the forgotten, they were all here, hidden in plain sight. Something scraped in the corner of the basement. Tabitha froze, heart hammering. She hadn't heard footsteps before, but now the shadows seemed to pulse, moving just beyond the weak light of the single bulb. The ledger trembled in her hands, but she could not tear herself away. Whoever, or whatever, might be watching could wait. The need to understand, to document, outweighed the creeping fear clawing at her mind. She continued to read, discovering that the entries became more frequent in recent years, almost obsessive. The last few pages were handwritten in ink so dark it seemed freshly poured. The dates were unnervingly recent, some even from the past month, as if the community's work of capturing and cataloguing continued without pause. As she leaned closer, she noticed marginal notes, tiny annotations beside each new entry, sometimes a word, sometimes a single symbol, each one carrying a weight that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. Silent, obedient, ready, gone, words that suggested more than mere description. She felt a cold dread settle over her, a visceral certainty that the ledger was not simply administrative but a map of control, a blueprint of confinement. It was as if each name represented a tether, binding a life to the compound's invisible rules, never to be released. Her head spun with the implications. The people outside, the calm, hollow-eyed residents she had seen, the rehearsed smiles, the careful choreography, all of it made sense now. This ledger explained the invisible boundaries, the weight of fear and obedience, the reason no one left. The records were not merely historical, they were a warning, a blueprint, a silent yet unmistakable statement. The community held dominion over those who crossed its threshold, and it had done so for decades with meticulous precision. Tabitha's journalistic instincts battled with her rising panic. She had evidence now, undeniable proof that something monstrous, something deliberate, had occurred here for 27 years. Yet fear pressed down harder than curiosity ever had. Every shadow in the basement seemed to lengthen, every whisper of air carried a subtle threat, as if the walls themselves were aware of her intrusion. She realized that discovering the ledger was not just a revelation, it was a declaration. The truth had found her, and it demanded attention, but it also demanded caution. One wrong move, one careless glance, and she could become the next name inscribed in its pages, a statistic added to a ledger that had long been silent but never empty. Tabitha had barely slept since discovering the ledger. The basement, with its brittle pages and cryptic annotations, haunted her dreams. Shadows moved in the corners of her mind, and the distant chanting from the compound seemed to follow her even in the few hours of uneasy rest she allowed herself. The community itself, which had appeared serene and orderly at first glance, now felt like a living organism, breathing around her, watching her, subtly shaping her movements without overtly interfering. Every interaction she had during the day carried an undercurrent of something unspoken, a tension that clung to her as tightly as the fog outside the compound gates. It was during one of her cautious walks along the edge of the garden that she first met Samuel, a man in his early 40s with worn hands and a quiet demeanor. He had been tending the small rows of vegetables, his movements deliberate but tired, almost as if he were performing a task he no longer found joy in. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, not of acquaintance, but of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement that she did not fully belong yet desperately wanted to know the truth. "You've seen the ledger, haven't you?" he asked in a low voice, careful not to draw attention. The word sent a shiver down her spine, and she nodded, clutching her notebook as though it were a talisman. Over the next hours, Samuel led her to a small, secluded space behind the main hall, where they could speak with minimal risk of being overheard. He was cautious, as though the very act of speaking about the community's secrets was dangerous, yet his eyes burned with the kind of fear that could only come from experience. "I can tell you things," he said quietly, "but once you know, there's no turning back. And some of us don't last long after that." The words were ominous, but Tabitha was driven by a need she could not suppress. She pressed him for details, gently probing, asking about the ledger, the names, the disappearances. Samuel hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve, and then he began to speak, recounting stories of people who had arrived with hope and curiosity, only to vanish without warning, as if swallowed by the very earth beneath the compound. Their conversation stretched into the night. The air around them was thick, heavy with the smell of damp wood and faint incense, as if the compound itself tried to cloak its sinister activity in mundane ritual. Samuel's voice quivered as he spoke of friends and relatives who had simply stopped existing. he described the subtle warning signs, the way newcomers would be isolated under the guise of guidance, the way chores and devotion were used to test obedience, and the way dissent, even in thought, was carefully monitored. "They watch everything," Samuel whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Even now, they know we're talking." The gravity of his words made Tabitha's stomach knot. She was a journalist, trained to document and expose, but for the first time, she felt fear that went beyond personal danger. This was a fear rooted in inevitability. The next morning, Tabitha woke to an eerie silence that stretched across the compound. The chanting and murmured prayers she had grown accustomed to were gone, replaced by an almost suffocating stillness. She stepped outside to find Samuel nowhere in sight. At first, she thought he might be working, tending the gardens or assisting with morning chores. But as the hours passed, his absence became increasingly conspicuous. She asked others, carefully, in casual tones, if they had seen him. The responses were polite but evasive, head shaking subtly, eyes briefly meeting hers before darting away. No one would outright say he had disappeared, but the avoidance itself spoke volumes. Her pulse quickened, and she felt the oppressive gaze of the compound, as if it were aware of her growing suspicion. Tabitha's unease turned into outright panic when she retraced the paths they had walked together. Samuel's favorite spots, the narrow path behind the hall, the small clearing by the garden, the quiet nook where they had spoken, were all empty, undisturbed. Yet, there was a subtle presence, an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like a residue of human occupancy that had vanished too abruptly to leave a mark. The realization settled over her like a stone: Samuel was gone. And in a place like this, gone was never temporary. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but fear held her tongue. The compound had rules, and she had already learned, indirectly, how dangerous it was to break them. As evening approached, she noticed other residents moving differently. Tasks continued, voices carried on, yet there was an underlying tension, almost imperceptible, as if everyone knew something that she did not, as if the disappearance of one of their own was both routine and unspoken. Every glance she caught felt loaded, weighted with warnings and silent admonishments. Tabitha realized that the first vanishing was not merely a single event, it was a demonstration, a silent message to those who dared question, to those who dared intrude. She felt the ledger's presence in her mind, its names like ghosts, each one a reminder of what might await her if she crossed the invisible boundaries too aggressively. Night fell, and Tabitha lay awake, thinking of Samuel and the ledger and the eerie calm that had returned to the compound. Fear mingled with determination. She knew now that the community's power was subtle but absolute, that disappearances were deliberate, methodical, and enforced in ways she could not yet understand. The first vanishing was proof, evidence that the rumors were true and that her presence was no longer merely observation, it was a threat. Somewhere in the darkness, the air seemed to whisper warnings, the very walls echoing with silent threats. She understood, with a clarity that chilled her blood, that staying meant watching, recording, and surviving the unseen gaze that had claimed so many before her. The line between curiosity and danger had blurred completely, and the first vanishing had ensured that she could never forget it, nor ignore it, nor step outside the compound's grasp unscathed. The day after Samuel's disappearance, Tabitha moved with a heightened awareness, every step weighted with the knowledge that she was under scrutiny. The compound, with its quiet routines and practiced serenity, now felt like a carefully constructed stage, one designed to lull outsiders into complacency before ensnaring them. She wandered through the hallways, notebook and camera in hand, her eyes scanning for anything that might reveal the truth behind the ledger and the disappearances. The chanting she had once dismissed as part of some religious routine now seemed sinister, as if it masked something darker below the surface. Something in her gut urged her downward, to the places hidden beneath the surface of the building, where the real story might be waiting. Her search led her to the rear of the main hall, where the floorboards were warped and uneven. At first, she had assumed it was just the natural decay of an old building, but as she ran her fingers along the edges, she noticed subtle seams, almost imperceptible hinges, and a small indentation in the wood that could serve as a handle. She knelt and pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs. The panel resisted at first, then gave way with a groan that echoed unnaturally through the otherwise silent hall. A cold draft rushed up from the opening, carrying with it the faint scent of earth, mold, and something else she could not name, a metallic tang that made her stomach twist. She peered into the darkness below, the beam of her flashlight piercing the blackness and revealing a narrow staircase that descended sharply, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow sound itself. With a mixture of dread and determination, Tabitha descended. The steps were narrow, the walls close, and the air grew colder with every movement downward. It was as if the very earth beneath the compound had conspired to isolate this hidden place, a secret repository for the things the community wanted to hide. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, catching on irregularities, scratches, faint stains, signs of long-neglected passage. At the bottom, she found a low, arched doorway, beyond which lay a chamber so dark that her light barely penetrated it. She stepped inside cautiously, the wooden floor groaning under her weight, and her breath caught as her eyes adjusted to the dim glow she had coaxed into the room. The hidden chamber was smaller than she expected, yet it exuded a presence that seemed to press against her chest, demanding attention. Every wall was lined with shelves and crates, and the contents of these containers made her stomach churn. Shoes, some worn and small, others larger and more battered, were stacked in careful piles. Toys, dolls missing eyes, books with pages torn and scribbled over, letters tied in faded ribbons, personal belongings of the vanished, lay as silent witnesses to the lives that had been taken. Each item was a fragment of existence, preserved as if in a museum of confinement. She ran her fingers over a small shoe, imagining the child who had worn it, and felt a pang of helplessness so sharp it made her knees tremble. Her eyes moved to a corner where bundles of letters were tied together with string. She untied one carefully, revealing a folded note with delicate handwriting. It spoke of longing, of hope, of despair, and of the invisible chains that bound the writer to the compound. Reading the words made her pulse quicken, for they were unmistakably recent. Someone had lived here, had written these letters, and had been taken into this hidden space, leaving traces of life behind while the community maintained its serene facade above. She realized that the ledger she had discovered was not just a record, it was an index, and this chamber was the proof, the tangible manifestation of the absences she could not yet fully comprehend. Tabitha moved methodically through the chamber, photographing the items, noting details, committing everything to memory. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets, every shadow hinted at hidden dimensions she could not yet perceive. The further she explored, the more she understood that this was not merely storage, it was an extension of control, a physical representation of the community's reach into the lives of those who had disappeared. The air carried a weight of sorrow and fear, a lingering residue of human presence that had been suppressed and curated over decades. It was as if the walls themselves remembered, and the room had been waiting for someone like her to uncover it, someone curious enough to peer beneath the carefully maintained surface. A soft sound behind her made her freeze. The room was otherwise still, yet she felt it, a presence, watching, assessing. Her flashlight trembled in her hands as she scanned the chamber, the beam settling on an empty crate in the far corner. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of observation was undeniable. The community's methods, she realized, were both subtle and absolute. Control above ground, containment below ground, and no one, no outsider, no insider, was ever free from their awareness. The chamber was a testament to decades of systematic disappearance, a hidden repository of human lives catalogued and preserved as a warning to any who might question the order imposed above. As she continued to document, she found small artifacts that suggested the vanished had tried to resist, leaving marks, scratches, and faint messages for anyone who might find them. These were the whispers of rebellion, fragile yet persistent, echoing through the chamber's darkness. The juxtaposition of control and resistance, of fear and hope, struck her with a force that left her breathless. She realized that this hidden space, with its meticulously arranged evidence, was more than proof, it was a story in itself, a narrative of captivity and endurance that the community above would rather remain buried. Tabitha's mind raced with possibilities. She knew that revealing this chamber could expose the truth, but she also understood the danger. The first vanishing had shown her the community's reach, their subtle omnipresence, and now she had irrefutable evidence that could condemn more than just herself if discovered. The weight of the hidden chamber pressed upon her, the very air thick with a history of vanished lives, a history she could not unsee or ignore, a history that would demand action even as it threatened her with the same fate. By the time Tabitha emerged from the hidden chamber, the sun had long since vanished behind the thickening hills, leaving the compound bathed in an oppressive twilight. The shadows of the spires stretched across the gravel like the fingers of some unseen hand, and the fog rolled in waves, curling around the edges of the buildings with almost deliberate intent. Every sound she made, each step, each breath, seemed amplified in the hush that had settled over the community, and she could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking her movements. The ledger, the letters, the shoes, and toys in the chamber, all of it now burned in her mind. She had proof. But proof was nothing in a place that had swallowed 300 lives over nearly 3 decades. She had learned the hard way that curiosity here was not a virtue, it was a risk. Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed him, the leader. He emerged from the main hall as if the dim light had summoned him, tall and composed, his presence commanding without effort. He wore the same calm expression she had first seen, but now it carried an edge, a subtle assertion of power that made her chest tighten. Every movement was deliberate, measured, precise, as if he were aware of not just her location but her very thoughts. He spoke before she could even form a question, his voice low and even, carrying a weight that pressed against her ears. "I see you've discovered what was hidden." That was inevitable. The words were neither threatening nor reassuring, and yet their effect was immediate and undeniable. Fear crept into her blood, sharp and cold. Tabitha swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. The room seemed to shrink around them, the fog outside and the shadows within forming an almost tangible wall that separated them from the world beyond the compound. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts at steadiness. "Why them? Why all of them?" Her hands clutched the ledger, the letters, the notebook, as if they were lifelines in a place that seemed to hunger for control. The leader's eyes flickered briefly, a shadow crossing the mask of serenity before it returned, perfectly poised. "We guide," he said softly, almost kindly, yet the words felt empty. "We protect. Outside, there is chaos. Here, there is order. Some do not understand the sacrifice until it is too late. Some must be removed to maintain the balance." His hands were open, inviting, but she noticed the subtle tension in his fingers, the almost imperceptible tightening that suggested both readiness and threat. He was calm, yet lethal in his certainty, a predator in a serene guise. Tabitha's mind raced. Every instinct told her to run, to escape before he could act, but she knew the truth now, running was not an option. Not here. Not after seeing the chamber, after holding the ledger in her hands. If she attempted to flee, the outcome would likely mirror Samuel's vanishing. The ledger had proven that the compound had its rules, and breaking them carried consequences. Her curiosity had brought her to this point, and the confrontation she had feared was now inevitable. "People don't come here by accident," he continued, stepping closer, his voice low enough to make her chest tighten. "You came because you were meant to see. Some truths are not for everyone. Some are for the few who can bear them." He circled her slowly, his gaze assessing, cataloguing, almost as if he were reading not just her body but her very thoughts. The hairs on her neck stood on end, a primal response to a presence that combined intellect, patience, and danger in ways that were impossible to ignore. "I've seen what you've done," Tabitha said, her voice gaining strength despite the fear that coursed through her veins. "I know about the ledger, the chamber, all of it. I can't ignore it. People need to know, people need to understand what's happening here." Her words were defiance, but they carried a tremor that betrayed her awareness of the stakes. The leader's eyes narrowed, but his lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Knowledge has a cost," he said softly, yet each syllable carried weight, finality. "Those who pry, who question, who witness, they are no longer the same as before. Some find purpose here. Others disappear. The choice, however, is never yours alone. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in a world built on order." He paused, letting the words sink in, each one falling like a stone into the churning river of her mind. She realized then that the confrontation was not merely verbal. Every gesture, every measured step, every calm, unwavering glance was a test, a probe into her resolve, her morality, and her instinct for survival. Tabitha felt the walls of the room close in, the fog pressing against the windows, the shadows leaning toward her as if they were extensions of the leader himself. She understood, with a clarity that was almost suffocating, that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Escape might be possible, but only if she could navigate a web of observation and subtle enforcement she barely understood. Her pulse raced, her mind spiraled with scenarios, and yet she could not look away from the man who had orchestrated decades of control, whose calm exterior masked a ruthless commitment to his vision. "You have seen what most never will," he said, stopping just short of touching her, his presence overwhelming yet strangely still. "You know what it means to cross boundaries, to look too closely. And now, you must choose. To stay, to witness, to participate, or to leave, risking the unknown consequences of stepping beyond what is allowed." His gaze was steady, unyielding, and in it she saw the truth: the community's power was absolute. The ledger, the hidden chamber, Samuel's disappearance, they were all threads in a design she was now entangled in, and the design itself cared little for intention or morality. Tabitha swallowed, the weight of the confrontation pressing down like the fog outside. Every instinct screamed to run, yet her curiosity and need for truth anchored her in place. The leader's presence was a test, a challenge, a judgment, but one that she had to face if she hoped to survive, if she hoped to reveal the truth, and if she hoped to escape the fate that had claimed so many before her. In that moment, she understood fully that the confrontation was not just about information or morality, it was about control, about dominance, about the invisible threads that bound life and death within the walls of the compound, threads she had now stumbled upon, threads she could not ignore, and threads she would have to navigate carefully if she hoped to leave the darkness unclaimed.